So anyway, class, for today, our discussion will be all about the heterogeneous systems. So specifically, class, we'll be talking about the colloidal system. Okay, tomorrow, class, we'll be discussing naman about the coarse dispersion. And then, if we still have time, we will discuss naman rheology. Okay? Pero kung hindi, baka sa asynchronous activity natin, class, ako mag-discuss regarding rheology. Okay? Okay. Now, anyway, class, what comes into mind when you hear the term heterogeneous? Kasi for the past few, for the entire midterms class, ang pinag-uusapan kasi natin doon was more on homogeneous systems. So when we say class homogeneous, it simply means na uniform yung system mo. Ibig sabihin ng class, natutunaw yung inyong solute sa solvent kung saan siya tinutunaw. Now, what about class heterogeneous system? When we say heterogeneous, yes, Ms. Kabalan, what comes into mind when you hear the term heterogeneous?
When we say heterogeneous po, kabaliktaran lang siya ng homogeneous. Kapag heterogeneous, hindi siya uniform. For example, yung colloidal nga po na topic natin for today, example siya ng heterogeneous mixture, for example, yung mga colloids. Yun po.
Alright, so thank you very much, Ms. Kabalan. That's good. Okay, so class, yes, that's true. Pag heterogeneous system class, ibig sabihin, okay, it's a two-phase system. Pag homogeneous kasi class, halimbawa, isang basong tubig. Oops. Halimbawa, isang baso ito ng tubig. Pag nilagyan ko to class ng sugar, halimbawa, sugar. Okay? Tapos kasi hindi natunaw ang sugar. Okay? Natunaw ang sugar. Okay, makikita nyo class, one phase lang to. This is a one-phase system. Ibig sabihin class, kitang-kita siya uniform yung kanyang consistency. It's technically transparent, right? Not until you make it super saturated, wherein some parts of the sugar will no longer be dissolved, kaya nagiging heterogeneous na siya. Pero basically, class, pag hindi mo pa na-meet yung saturation point ng inyong solution with sugar, then class, it becomes a one-phase system, hence it's homogeneous. Okay? In our case here, class, pag sinabi natin heterogeneous, it's a two-phase system. Now, the only question, class, is how do I make it uniform, especially for pharmaceuticals? Kasi, class, one of the requirements for pharmaceutical is for you to be able to give aesthetically pleasing products. At the same time, class, dapat uniform ang itsura niya. Pero we have to remember, class, some of our pharmaceuticals, okay, not all of them are soluble in water. A good example, class, amoxicillin. Okay, di ba kasi ang amoxicillin, you can't find it in its solution form. Most often than not, class, we provide it in its suspension form. Okay, naka-suspension siya. So, kasi sabihin ng class, well, one thing, pwedeng in terms of stability, mas stable siya kapag siya ay in its suspension form rather than solution form. Kasi remember, pag solution form agad yan, may water, mabilis masira yung amoxicillin natin. Mabilis mapanis, kumbaga. Pero if you make it into its suspension form, class, then it extends the shelf life of the product. So at the same time, class, kapag ginamit mo ang suspension natin, a heterogeneous system, oftentimes, class, yung mga particles mo, hindi yan natutunaw. Okay? Pero makikita mo, class, uniformly distributed siya sa kanyang dispersion medium or sa solvent kung saan siya tinutunaw. Unlike that class of a sugar solution, say for example, which is a homogeneous system, okay, tunaw sa buong solution yung ating solute. Dito, class, sa heterogeneous system, it's a two-phase system. Okay? We're in class, suspended or kumbaga kalat yung inyong particles or inyong drug or inyong solute sa buong solvent. Okay? So I hope that's clear, class. Technically, hindi siya tunaw, pero nangyayari, class, is lumulutang yung ating solute sa kanyang solvent. Right? Now, class, when we talk about heterogeneous system, normally we have two terms here. The dispersion phase and then the dispersion medium. Para lang mabilis maalala, class, pag sinabi natin dispersion phase. Okay, ito yung solute. Ito yung pinapalutang natin. Okay, then pag sinabi natin dispersion medium, ito yung solvent natin. Or kung saan lumulutang yung solute natin. Right? So I hope that's clear, class. So, a dispersed system, class, as I've told you a while ago, okay, usually consists of particulate matter known as a dispersed phase, which is yung solute nga natin, and then a continuous phase or a dispersion medium. Okay? So, class, kung ito ang ating solution, itong box na to, so yung mga particles na lumulutang, class, is known as the dispersed phase. Normally, class, ang mga particles na to hindi natutunaw. Okay? Malaki sila. Okay, they're big enough, class. At the same time, they do not dissolve in the dispersion medium, or what we call the continuous phase. Now, what prevents oftentimes, class, a dispersed phase from dissolving in a continuous phase or the solvent is the interfacial region. Yung interfacial region na yan, class, creates a tension. Okay? Kung titingnan nyo, class, di ba? Pag ang mantika at saka tubig pinaghalo nyo, di ba may separation? Okay, nagkakaroon ng distinct separation yan. Okay, yun yung, di ba, yun, because that's simply because of the surface tension created, or the interfacial tension created between the oil and the water. Now, similar to that, class, yung ating mga dispersed phase, okay, around it, surrounding it, class, okay, is what we call the interfacial region, which prevents it from solubilizing completely with the continuous phase. So I hope that makes sense, class, ha? Ito, kumbaga, class, yung interfacial region na yan, ito yan, it separates the dispersed phase from the continuous phase. So are we clear? So I hope that's clear, class. Okay, now there are three types of dispersed phase. We have the molecular dispersion, colloidal dispersion, and the coarse dispersion. So for today, class, we'll be focusing more on the colloidal dispersion. Tomorrow, we'll talk about the coarse dispersion naman. Okay? Now, ano ba pinagkaiba ng isa sa isa? Now, pag sinabi natin, class, molecular dispersion, ito yung mga particles with less than 1 nanometer in size. Oftentimes, class, the molecular dispersion, okay, kung ang involved is a molecular dispersion, oftentimes, class, what we create is a, technically, class, a homogeneous system. Okay? Oftentimes, this is invisible in an electron microscope and can pass through ultrafilters or semi-permeable membranes. And they can undergo rapid diffusion. So examples of which, class, are oxygen molecule, ordinary ions, or glucose. So ano naman natin, class, these are solutes that can dissolve in water or in their solvent. At the same time, class, oftentimes creates a homogeneous system. Okay, what about colloids? Ano bang meron naman sa mga colloids natin? So colloids, class, are definitely larger than your molecular dispersions or yung mga yung molecular dispersion phase. Okay, we're in, class, kanina in nanometers ang range niya. Pag colloids, class, in micrometers naman siya. So mas technically mas malaki siya compared sa oxygen, sa glucose, and so on and so forth. So colloids, class, are liquid preparations composed of pyroxene dissolved in a solvent mixture that's usually composed of alcohol and ether with or without added medicinal substances. Now, they are normally intended, class, for external application to the skin. Now, what separates, class, a colloid from other preparations is simply, class, okay, the property it possesses. Solutions, class, oftentimes have small particles, ions, or molecules. Okay? Kaya ang tendency, class, is it creates a homogeneous mixture. Okay? Homogeneous siya. One-phase system siya. Kaya, class, ang itsura niya is transparent. Okay? A solution is always, or most of the time, it's transparent. And they do not separate. Once na natunaw na ang particles ko sa solution ko, mahirap silang paghiwalayin. Okay? Pwede natin paghiwalayin, class, pero it will take special considerations, okay, or kumbaga gagamit tayo ng mga apparatuses to separate the ions from the solution or from the solvent. Pero technically, class, when a solution is created, it's difficult to separate the solute from the solvent. Okay, so they cannot be filtered because of their very minute size, and they do not scatter light. Unlike now, class, what about suspension? Suspension naman have very large particles. Okay, and they tend to settle. Kumbaga, class, suspensions are naapektuhan sa ng gravity. Okay? Because of their large particle size, class, okay? So definitely dahil malaking particle size niya, mabigat din siya, so it tends to settle down after a while. Okay? And they can be filtered and must steer to stay suspended. Kaya nga 'di ba ang mga suspension natin, laging may label na shake well before using para ma-maintain natin na suspended yung kanyang particles. Okay? We'll talk more about this tomorrow, class. Now again, our concern for today is more on the colloids. So, class, colloids have medium-sized particles. Not too small, na makakonsider siya as small as a molecule, but not too big as compared to your suspension. So, they have medium-sized particles. They cannot be filtered pa rin, okay, but they can be separated via a semi-permeable membrane. Okay? So, they are large enough to pass through, they're small enough to pass through a filter paper, but not small enough to pass through a semi-permeable membrane. And they have the tendency, class, to scatter light. Okay? One good example class of a colloid would also be fog. Okay, na-experience nyo na ba makakita ng fog? Na-experience nyo ba pumunta ng Baguio? Pag malamig ang panahon, di ba? Pansinin nyo class, pag foggy ang environment ninyo, okay, mag-on kayo ng flashlight. Di ba makikita nyo ang flashlight, nagkikreate siya ng shape, parang conical shape. Okay, if this is the flashlight class, makikita nyo parang cone yung shape niya. Alright? That's the property class of colloids kasi wherein they can scatter light, which we call the Tyndall effect. Okay, the Faraday-Tyndall effect actually. Okay, wherein they can scatter light. Simply because class, the particles here, okay, in a colloid can disperse the light. Okay, nadi-disperse niya yung light na yon. Unlike class, if you say for example, put a light through a solution. Okay, kunwari ito yung basong tubig. Tubig lang yan. Class, pag nilagyan mo ng ilaw dyan, ano ba, ito yung flashlight, anong mapapansin nyo sa ilaw? Okay, hindi nyo mapapansin yung class na nagkikreate ng cone shape, right? You won't see a cone shape. Technically, wala ka makikita dyan. Basta magpapass through lang yung light. Because class, it's a solution. The particles inside the solution is too small to be able to scatter the light. So are we clear? So are we good? So colloids class, because of their particle size, and at the same time class, colloids are in constant motion. I'll explain this in a while. Okay, in a constant motion siya lagi. Kaya nga class, ang tendency is na-scatter niya talaga yung ilaw. Or hindi kaya, another good example class. Halimbawa, sobrang dumi ng kwarto ninyo. Okay, hindi kayo nagwalis ng 10 taon. Di ba kasi mamumuo yung alikabok dyan. Okay, pag may alikabok yan class, di ba, pag halimbawa, nagpagpag ka, kakalat yung alikabok, makikita mo class yung rays ng sun. Hindi mo makikita mo yung yung rays ng sun na gumaganon. Okay, tawag dito, visible sa eyes natin class yung rays ng sun. It's because the rays of the sun is being scattered by the colloids, by the alikabok. Alright? So yun, hope that makes sense. So, examples of colloids from our daily lives. So, foams is a colloid. Milk is a colloid, just so you know. Fog, detergents, aerogels. The blood class is a very good example of a colloid. Okay? Kaya kaya na siyang paghiwalayin usually through centrifugation. Paints and cosmetics. These are all examples of colloids. So, basically, class, the characteristic of a colloid would be its particle size is between 1 nanometer to 0.5 micrometers. Okay, so normally, class, umaabot sa micrometer ang size ng isang colloid. Can be detected under an ultramicroscope and is visible in electron microscope. And can pass through filter paper, but again, do not pass through a semi-permeable membrane. And they diffuse very slowly. Okay, dahan-dahan lang yung pag-diffuse niyan. Right? And remember, class, that a colloid is always in constant motion. Okay? Colloids are in constant motion. And this constant motion class actually creates the stability or is the factor affecting the stability of a colloid. Just so you know, class, a colloid system is a very stable system. Okay? It's a stable system. Kaya nga, because of its stability class, okay, it's widely used pharmaceutically. I'll explain later why is it very stable once we start dealing with the properties of colloids. Now, anyway, okay, so sabi nga class kanina, a colloid cannot be separated using filters, okay, but ordinary filter paper, but it can be separated using a semi-permeable membrane. So hence class, ano ba ang isang separation method na alam natin na gumagamit ng isang semi-permeable membrane? Okay, just syempre papasok ang ating dialysis. Okay, so it basically class uses semi-permeable membrane that permits the passage of small molecules but not those of colloidal size. Okay, a good example class of an organ that uses this type of filtration mechanism inside our body is of course the kidneys. Okay, the kidneys class uses semi-permeable membranes within its nephrons to allow the removal class of ions such as sodium, potassium, magnesium, okay, or waste products class that are in molecular sizes, but they do not allow the removal of blood products like blood cells, okay, because blood class is of colloidal particle size, okay, or glucose. Actually, glucose nakakalabas pala yun. Nire-reabsorb lang yan sa katawan natin. Okay, na the kidneys has an area, okay, you'll talk more about this in pharmacology, because there are areas in the kidneys class which allows for the reabsorption of water and glucose. Okay, kaya hindi, normally class, you don't find glucose in the urine. Not unless supersaturated na ang amounts of glucose in your bloodstream. Or nakakalabas na siya. Okay, in the case of diabetes. Right? Okay, so electrodialysis is one of the best way of purifying colloids because class, one of the things that you have to remember about colloids is that colloid particles class have a charge. Okay, it can either be positively charged or negatively charged. So hence class, if you use a colloid, okay, let it pass through a semi-permeable membrane, dagdagan mo ng electric gradient. Halimbawa, negative ang charge, ito. Halimbawa, negative ang charge ng colloids. Ito yung semi-permeable membrane. Para mapabilis ang sistema class, lagyan ko dito ng cathode. Okay? Cathode or anything class that contains a positive charge. So tendency class is, yung colloid na to, pwedeng maiwan lang siya dito. Pero hindi siya magpapass through semi-permeable membrane. Okay? So it's not going to pass through the semi-permeable membrane. Or di kaya class, pwede, halimbawa, anode, gagamit ako. Okay? Or anything that's negatively charged. So negative to, so tendency is marerepel siya. Hindi siya sasama sa semi-permeable membrane, but the dispersion medium, which is often the opposite charge, okay, of your colloid, sasama dito. Okay? Kaya na-filter out yung colloid natin. Ma-filter out natin yung colloid natin. Right? So I hope that makes sense. And then the next process class of separating a colloid, okay, would be through the use of ultrafiltration. Okay? Now in ultrafiltration class, this one uses hydraulic pressure to force the solvent and small particles to pass through the filter, leaving colloidal particles behind. Right? Okay. Now, what are the different types of colloidal systems? There are two types lang naman class. We have the lyophilic and then the lyophobic. Okay? Difference class of one from the other. Lyophilic, ibig sabihin, it's loving. What does it love? It loves solvent. Whatever the solvent may be. It may be water, so it may be a water solvent. Okay, so making it a hydrophilic substance, a hydrophilic colloid, sorry. So if it's if the solvent is oil, so it's going to be a lipophilic substance. Okay, so basically class, lyophilic, lipophilic sinabi ko kanina, meaning loving niya ang lipids. So a lyophilic colloid class simply a solvent-loving colloid, while a lyophobic colloid is something that hates, it hates its solvent. Okay. So usually class, a lyophilic colloid can interact appreciably with its dispersion medium or yung kanyang solvent. Okay. And a lyophilic colloid class oftentimes create what we call a sol. A colloidal dispersion or what we call a sol. Okay, tandaan nyo na class ha. Pag lyophilic ang colloid natin, okay, ibig sabihin, it creates what we call a sol. Ano ba yung mga example ng mga sols natin? We have hydrosols, organosols, aerosols. Aerosols. Siguro naman, alam niyo naman kung ano ibig sabihin, anong isang aerosol, right? Okay, aerosol class, a good example would be yung foam. Halimbawa, shaving cream or shaving foam. Halimbawa, again, that's an example class of a colloid system. Okay? Yun nga lang, ano pinagkaiba nito? An aerosol class has a solid, okay, normally solid ang kanyang dispersion phase, pero yung kanyang dispersion medium is liquid in gaseous medium. Okay, sorry. Ang kanyang dispersion medium is gaseous. Okay, ang kanyang dispersion phase can either be solid or liquid. Right? Organosol naman class, okay, ito naman, oftentimes organic solvents, okay, such as polystyrene, ang involved dito. Or pag hydrosols naman would be acacia, gelatin, or insulin. Okay? Acacia class would be the dispersion phase. Tapos yung kanyang medium would be oftentimes a liquid. Right? Kaya nga siya na hydrosol. Okay, and this one class, acacia, gelatin, and insulin are all soluble in water. Alright? Now, pag lyophilic naman ang colloid ko, okay, sabi nga natin class, these are solvent-hating colloids. Okay, so they have little or no attraction for their dispersion medium. Oftentimes, class, if your colloid is lyophobic, gagamit tayo ng third agent dito para magkaroon tayo ng homogeneous mixture. Okay? Mixture pa rin siya. Hindi siya masasabing solution kasi hindi siya natunaw eh. Okay? Tandaan nyo, class, ha, pag natunaw ang solvent natunaw ang solute sa solvent, that creates a solution. Pero kapag ang solute hindi natunaw sa solvent, you have there a mixture. Now, ang question na lang is that mixture homogeneous or heterogeneous? Okay, pag homogeneous, ibig sabihin very uniform ang kanyang itsura. Pero pag heterogeneous, oftentimes class, hindi uniform ang kanyang itsura. Makikita mo yung mga particles, halimbawa, like a colloid. Okay? Or suspension din, actually. Suspensions are heterogeneous by nature. So hence, class, makikita mo pa rin yung particles. Right? Okay. So in this case, class, so gold, silver, sulfur, silver iodide, hindi siya natutunaw sa kanyang dispersion medium. So hence, class, ang ginagawa natin is nagdadagdag tayo ng surfactant to allow, okay, so you add surfactants here. Okay, to allow the solubility of your solute, or sorry, of your dispersion phase to the dispersion medium. Right? Now, other special methods class to create a lyophobic colloid would be first, okay, by dispersion. So yung coarse particles, i-reduce natin in its size. Okay, or through condensation. Materials of subcolloidal dimensions are caused to aggregate into particles within the colloidal size range. Kasi once class nasa colloidal size range na yan, so that's 1 nanometer to 0.5 micrometers. Kaya tendency class is nagkikreate siya ng tinatawag natin na, nagkakaroon siya ng colloidal properties na. Okay, which helps out para mag-disperse yung colloid natin, yung particles. Hindi siya mag-settle down lang. Alright? Okay, next one class are the association colloids. So we have the lyophilic, then the lyophobic. Again, class lyophilic loves its solvent. Lyophobic hates its solvent. Okay? Now, pag sinabi naman natin class association colloids, dito na ngayon papasok yung mga amphiphilic colloids natin. Amphiphilic class meaning it can either be hydrophilic or lipophilic. Certain parts of this colloid class can love water. Certain other parts of it can hate water. So kung mga class, ano ba? Pwede sa lalaki, pwede sa babae. Parang ganun. Bisexual, halimbawa. Okay, yung colloids na to. Okay? So amphiphilic siya. So characterized by having two distinct regions of opposing solution affinities within the same molecule or ion. Okay, and aggregates of this type of subcolloidal particles class can create what we call a micelle. Okay, micelle. Now, class, before we proceed to that, let's first talk about what is an example of an amphiphilic substance or amphiphilic colloid. Okay, a good example of this class would be the lipid bilayer membrane. Okay, I hope you still remember the lipid bilayer membrane. Diba class, ang lipid bilayer membranes, may mga hydrophilic heads. Hydrophilic, excuse me, 1L lang nga pala hydrophilic heads. And then it has a hydrophobic tail. Kaya nga yung exposed sa blood would be, of course, the hydrophilic heads. Okay? Now, this one class, isang ganito, this is amphiphilic. Okay? Bakit siya amphiphilic? Kasi yung ulo, okay, the head part class loves water, but the tail parts hates the water. Okay? So it has both a hydrophilic and a hydrophobic side. Right? So, does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. Okay? Now, class, pag pinagsama-sama ko kasi yung mga monomers na to, okay, pinagsama-sama ko, usually, class, about 50 of these monomers, I create a micelle. Okay? So what is a micelle? So it's an aggregate class of 50 or more monomers. So ito, class, is one monomer. All right? This one is a reverse micelle. Dito mo tayo sa ordinary micelle pala. Sorry. Okay? We're in class. This is the hydrophilic head. Tapos ito naman, class, yung hydrophobic tail. Okay? Takot sa tubig. Tapos yung isang part is gusto ang tubig. So hence, class, it's amphiphilic. Okay? It has two properties. Now, pag pinagsama-sama ko 50 or more aggregates of this monomer, I create what we call a micelle. Now, the concentration class of monomers at which micelle is formed is termed as the critical micelle concentration. So again, it depends, class, how many monomers do I need to combine to create a micelle. So pag halimbawa na-reach ko, kunwari, 50 monomers, biglang nag-create na ako ng micelle. So that's the critical micelle concentration ko. Meaning 50 monomers would be enough to create a micelle. A micelle class, again, is parang spherical ang shape niyan. Okay? Spherical ang shape. So the number of monomers class that aggregates to form a micelle is known as the aggregation number. Okay? Now, a micelle class can have two properties. It can either be soluble in water or soluble in oil. Okay, yung kanyang dispersion, yung kanyang affinity towards a dispersion medium. Pero class, within it, pwede tayong magkulong ng drug. Okay? Halimbawa class, like this one. A normal micelle would be usually oil in water. Meaning, oil, dito nakalagay yung drug. Tapos class, yung water part, itong water, ang hydrophilic head na to, allows this drug to dissolve in water. Kahit na technically, that drug is oil. Is an oil drug. Nagets ba, class? Right? So let me repeat this. If my drug, say for example, class is oil-based siya, I can entrap it in a micelle. Okay? Halimbawa, ito yung drug ko. My drug is technically oil. So obviously, class, alam kong hindi siya matutunaw sa tubig, right? Okay? Pero class, kung ipapasok ko to sa katawan, right? Di ba kasi ang requirement for a drug to be absorbed is that it should be water soluble. So since my drug is already oil, so wala na ba siyang pag-asa? May pag-asa pa siya. Ang pwede kong gawin, class, is yung drug ko, which is an oil, ipapasok ko sa isang micelle that is oil in water. Oil in water. Now, this drug class, which is an oil, I'll allow it to enter inside the micelle. Then, class, the drug will be protected by the hydrophobic tails. Okay? Dahil oil din yan eh. Oil, the hydrophobic tail loves oil. Okay? So, ipasok ko siya dyan. Tapos kasi yung drug ko, palilibutan siya ngayon ng hydrophilic heads. Ito yun. Which allows now the drug to dissolve in water. Alright? So, that's one of the applications class of micelles. It could be, tapos kasi pwede natin baliktarin. Okay? A reverse micelle wherein water yung sa loob, oil, okay, ang hydrophilic heads ang sa loob, hydrophobic tails ang nasa labas, which allows naman the drug, a water-soluble drug, to enter into the cell membrane. Okay, alam niyo naman na cell membrane is oil by nature. Okay? So does that make sense? Are we good, class? Are we good so far?
Yes po, sir.
All right, good. All right, good. So yan, class, ang application nito. Okay, of micelle formation. So basically, class, amphiphils can be anionic, cationic, non-ionic, or ampholytic, or zwitterionic. Pag sinabi natin, class, zwitterionic, okay, pag zwitterionic, parang ano na siya, parang micelle. Okay? Pero instead na water-soluble, lipid-soluble, pag zwitterion, class, okay, some parts of it are anionic, while other parts of it are cationic. Okay? Are we good? So some parts are positively charged, some parts are negatively charged. Okay, so kumbaga, pag ang isang amphiphile ko is zwitterionic, okay, it has affinity for both anions and cations. Okay? Okay, so shapes of micelles class can either be spherical, it could be reverse. So nakita niyo kayo na, spherical. Okay, ito siya. Spherical. Tapos class reverse, wherein hydrophilic heads are on the inside, hydrophobic tails are on the outside. Okay, and then laminar class, laminar, kapag, tawag dito. Okay, pag straight siya, class, parang ganito. Okay, laminar yan. Or laminar. Kumbaga, class, parang yung lipid bilayer membrane natin. Alright? So, the lipid bilayer membrane class is an example of a lamellar organization for our a micelle. Okay? Then lastly, class, will be the Jejen ions. Okay? Pag Jejen ions naman to, class, these are sodium ions bound attracted to the surface of a micelle. Okay? So basically, class, pag Jejen ions, naalala ko dati nung college kami, tawag ko namin ito is Jeje, parang ang naalala namin is Jejemon. Okay? Pero Jejen ions, class, okay, may involvement ng sodium ions dito. Okay, yun lang naman yun eh. Thus, it's bound to the surface of a micelle, thus reducing the overall negative charge of the micelle. Okay? Kasi tandaan nyo, class, sodium ions is positive. Positive ang charge niyan. So, pag na-bound siya, class, sa isang micelle, And oftentimes, micelle kasi class is negatively charged. So, because may positive charge na nag-bind sa kanya, nababawasan ngayon yung negativity ng isang micelle. Okay? Which, to the point class, pwede siya maging neutral ang charge niya. Okay, so, does that make sense? Basta tandaan nyo lang class, pag dyan ions, may sodium na ion involved na nag-bound sa negative micelles natin. Negatively charged micelles. Okay? So, here are just some examples, class, of colloidal dispersions. Okay? So, halimbawa, pag ang dispersed phase mo is liquid, tapos gas ang iyong dispersion medium, oftentimes we create a liquid aerosol. Okay, such as fogs, liquid sprays. Pag solid naman ang ating dispersion phase, then ang dispersion medium ko is a gas, then we create a solid aerosol. Okay, such as smokes or dust. Okay? Usually, ang smoke class, halimbawa, di ba may mga soot? Yung soot. Ayun yun. Or dust na lang. Okay, tapos, and so on and so forth. Okay, so hindi natin pag-uusapan to. You can easily read about this. So, halimbawa, pag liquid, ang iyong dispersion phase, tapos liquid in dispersion medium, you create an emulsion. Good example class would be mayonnaise. Okay, mayonnaise. Ano ba nilalagay sa mayonnaise? Usually, di ba? Suka. Okay, tapos nalagyan natin ng, or di kaya kalamansi. Tapos, oil. Tapos nalagyan natin ng egg white as the surface active agent natin. Tapos, i-mix mo lang yun. So, both are liquid, oil and okay, oil, the suka, and then the egg white. So, you create a mayonnaise. Right, and so on and so forth. So, I won't read this anymore. You can read this by yourself. Now, let's talk about, class, the optical properties of our colloids. So, as I told you a while ago, class, one of the main properties kasi of colloids is that they can scatter light. Okay, they can scatter light. If usually you put a flashlight through a solution, di ba, hindi makikita yung shape ng light. Pero, class, if you pass it through a colloid, it creates what we call a conical shape. Parang cone. Ganon. Okay, so when a strong beam of light, class, pass through a colloidal sol, a visible cone is observed. Okay, resulting from the scattering of light by the colloidal particles. Kasi remember, class, the particles within this system is in constant motion. That motion, class, is what we call the Brownian motion. Okay? Now, because it is constantly in motion, okay, ang tendency, class, pag tinamaan siya ng light, okay, pag tinamaan ng light ang isang particle, what does it do? It bounces off. It bounces the light off. Okay? Class, again, constant motion yan. So, ang tendency is, nakikita mo ngayon yung shape ng ilaw natin. Right? So, an ultramicroscope is often used to examine the light points responsible for the Tyndall cone. Okay? So, yung light scattering property natin, class, again, can be measured. Okay, oftentimes, class, the scattering can be described in terms of turbidity. Okay, and the machine, class, that we use for this is what we call the QELs or the KELs, the quasi-elastic light scattering. Okay, machine or ano. So it's a technique that uses laser light and can determine diffusion coefficients and particle sizes of macromolecules in a solution. So what does it do, class? Basically, class, kung ito ang aking solution, colloid, okay, magpapass through ako ng light dyan. Normally a laser, which is of course pinpoint yung yung light concentrated. So class, di ba, obviously, as the light passes through here, okay, magkakaroon tayo ng cone shape dyan. Right? Cone shape. And of course, class, these particles will tend to absorb light. Now, class, dahil intense ang laser ko, pag nag-pass through yan sa colloids, nawawala ng intensity yon, right? Mawawala ng intensity kasi ina-absorb yun ng mga colloidal particles. So therefore, class, an analyzer here, it will analyze how intense the light is. So of course, class, the less intense ang lumalabas na light dito, okay, sa light trap na to, less intense yan, class. Ibig sabihin, masyadong marami ang colloidal size, ang colloids, masyadong marami. Or either masyadong marami or masyadong malaki yung colloids. Or it absorbs too much light. Kasi class, kung maliit yung size ng colloids na yan, walang ma-absorb na light. So, ang tendency, pag walang na-absorb na light, tatagos lang yan dito. So, it's going to be very intense. Ang light natin will still be intense. Pero dahil may colloid, may particles na pwedeng mag-absorb sa light, nawawalan ng intensity yung laser. Alright? And the analyzer, class, will determine how intense the light is after mag-pass through sa colloids. So, of course, kasi the less intense, meaning the more turbid the solution is. The more colloids there are, the more particles there are in the solution. So therefore, class, doon ko malalaman kung gaano ka dami ang colloids sa water or sa solution. Nagets ba, class? Are we clear? Are you good so far?
Po, sir.
Alright, good. Kasi class, tandaan nyo, pag kayo magte-thesis na class, di ba gagamit kayo ng colorimeter? Just so you know, class, the colorimeter uses the same principle or a turbidimeter. Okay? Wherein we are trying to check for the colloids created. Doon mo malaman yan yung concentration ng desired substance mo. Okay? And this one actually, class, has more applications in quality assurance too. Okay, wherein determine yung mga concentration sa mga drugs ninyo. Again, class, it uses this property, the light scattering property. Alright? Okay. So, yun. Ito yung principle na ginagamit dito, class. Kaya, again, it's very important that we understand this. Right? Okay, so ito yung sinasabi ko sa inyo kayo na class na Brownian motion. Okay? Wherein our particles are in constant motion. Okay, usually class caused by the erratic movement of particles as large as 5 micrometers. The velocity of particles class increases with a decreasing particle size for one main reason. Mas maliit, smaller the particle size. Okay, lesser mass. So therefore, lesser ang effect ng gravity sa kanya. Right? Kaya sa class, pag mas maliit yung particle size, mas mabilis siya nakapag-move. The larger the particle size is, ito, okay, ang tendency class, hindi siya makapag-move ng mabilis. Right? So dahil less gravity, increase velocity. Now, class, another thing that we can do to affect or to reduce the velocity of the movement of the particle size, to reduce Brownian motion, okay, is by increasing the viscosity of the medium. Obviously, class, kung mas malapot yung medium, mas mabagal yung movement nila. Alright? Now, class, the question here, of course, would always be, sir, why are colloids in constant motion? Okay, why is it moving constantly? There's one main reason for that, class. Oftentimes, class, colloids have similar charges. Similar ang charge. Okay? So now, kung similar ang charge niyan, halimbawa, ito isang negative colloid, another negative colloidal particle. Sa tingin nyo, magdidikit yan dahil negative ang charge nila? Will they stick to one another? Okay?
Hindi po.
Alright, very good, Ms.
Repel
Rio.
po.
Okay, very good. So basically, class, because they are of opposing charges, ang tendency, class, is they're going to repel each other. Now, isipin nyo na lang, dahil similar sila lahat ng charge, biglang may negative charge pa dito. Okay, so magre-repel na naman. Eh, andito may isang negative charge, magre-repel na naman. Kaya oftentimes, class, a Brownian motion is what we call a zigzag pattern. Okay? It's a zigzag pattern. So, tingnan nyo, zigzag lagi yan. So, kasi, class, in constant, bouncing off sila lagi. Nag-bounce off sila lagi. Okay? So, does that make sense? So, of course, kasi the lighter, the smaller the colloid is, lighter siya. So, dahil lighter siya, mas mabilis siya mag-bounce off once na nakipag-meet siya sa isa pang colloidal particle. Right? And again, class, this Brownian motion actually creates the stability of a colloid. Kasi, class, again, a stable colloid is one that has a uniform appearance. Okay? A stable colloid is one that has a uniform appearance. Unlike that of suspension, class. Di ba ang suspension, kapag naghiwalay na yung particles sa kanyang dispersion medium, di ba sabi natin, hindi na yan stable. Correct? It's already, nag-separate na siya eh. Okay? Hindi na homogeneous yung itsura niya. So therefore, it's unstable na. Unlike that class of a colloid, ang hirap, matagal yan bago maghiwalay or bago mag-separate, bago siya mag-settle down. So that's why class colloids tend to be very stable. Right? So again, class, one way we can reduce the Brownian motion, parang pabagal siya, kasi mamaya masyadong mabilis naman yung movement, would be either increase viscosity or increase the particle size. Alright? Okay. Next one, class, the kinetic property of our colloids. Now, in terms of kinetic property, class, how it moves. Okay, in terms of diffusion and sedimentation. Now, class, in terms of diffusion, it's a direct result of the Brownian movement. So, technically, class, mabilis ang diffusion ng isang colloid. Mabilis siya mag-diffuse. Kasi nga, di ba sabi natin, in constant motion siya, so mabilis siya kumalat. Okay, so therefore, a colloid class has fast diffusion. Okay, so for colloids, mabilis ang diffusion. What about in terms of sedimentation? Okay, obviously, class, because colloids are normally in the micrometer size, and it's in constant motion, class, the particles are subjected to the force of gravity, pero technically, class, mabagal siya mag-sedimentation. Because nga, it's always in constant motion. So the Brownian movement, class, prevents the colloids to settle rapidly. Okay? So it's still governed by gravity, class, just so you know, still affected by gravity. Pero dahil nga of its charge, at the same time, its low molecular weight of it, or its particle size is very small, tendency is, instead na mag-settle down siya, lagi siyang suspended. Okay? If the particles are subjected to the force of gravity, the lower size limits of particles obeying Stokes' equation is about 0.5 micrometer. About 0.5 micrometers in size, class, normally, yun na, it starts to obey Stokes' law. Stokes' law nga pala, sorry, before I forget. Stokes' law, class, is the equation or the law that states that all particles, okay, are governed by gravity. And they will be, okay, they're also, the rate at which they are falling, okay, particles, the rate at which the particles are falling are simply governed by the gravity and the viscosity of their dispersion medium. Yun lang yung Stokes' law. Okay? Now, class, sabi ko nga sa inyo, lahat naman ng particles affected by gravity, or it will undergo sedimentation. True. But, there's a big but, okay? For colloids, class, oftentimes, at normal gravity, which is 9.8 meter per second squared, okay, hindi siya ganun ka-affected. Affected siya, pero not too much. What's affected mostly, class, by Stokes' law would be suspensions. Kaya, class, I'll discuss more about the Stokes' law. I'll explain this equation tomorrow. Tomorrow, sa course dispersion natin. Okay, regarding suspensions. Okay? Now, class, so, sir, ibig sabihin ba nito, pag colloid yan, forever na siyang suspended? Okay, there are ways, class, wherein we can allow a colloid to, how do you call this? To precipitate. Okay? Ihiwalay natin yung kanyang yung colloids na yan sa kanyang dispersion medium. And what we do, class, is we do centrifugation. Ano ba, class, ang binibigay natin, ang ina-add natin kapag nagsa-centrifuge tayo? We're actually adding, class, gravity. We're increasing the average gravity, class, 10 to 100 times more. Right? Okay? Para maghiwalay, class, yung colloidal particles sa kanyang dispersion medium. Does that make sense? Okay, class, again.
Yes,
Di ba? Thank you. Okay? So, di ba, class, example natin ng isang colloid is blood. Blood is a colloid. Okay? Now, class, pag hinayaan ko lang dyan yan, diba, lagay ko sa test tube rack, aabutin ako, class, ng siyam-siyam bago yun maghiwalay. So, anong gagawin ko, class, para maghiwalay siya ng mabilisan? Kasi colloid siya eh. Kaya matatagalan tayo bago maghiwalay yon. So, what do? I put it in a centrifuge. I increase the gravity. Gravity here, class, okay, is directly proportional to the velocity at which a particle settles. Okay? So, it's greatly affected, class, by the gravity, at the same time, inversely proportional to the viscosity of your dispersion medium. So, class, what I do here, I increase the gravity. Taasan ko yung gravity. E di bibilis ngayon yung sedimentation rate. Kaya maghihiwalay ngayon yung white blood cells sa serum. Alright? So, does that make sense? Okay tayo?
Yes po, sir.
Yes po, sir.
Right, good. Okay. So, another one, class, is viscosity. So, sabi nga natin, class, viscosity is the ability of a dispersion medium to resist flow. So, ano ba, class? Ano ang mas mataas ang viscosity? Water or honey?
Honey po.
Honey po.
Okay, very good. Definitely, class, it's the honey, right? It has more resistance to flow. Now, as to how much is that resistance is, pinag-uusapan natin ng class would be the poise, yung poise, okay, which is a unit for viscosity. Pag-uusapan naman natin yan, class, sa rheology na. Right? Pero basically, class, viscosity of the dispersion medium, okay, can greatly affect how the colloids behave in a system. Okay, so the thicker it is, lesser ang movement. The thinner the dispersion medium is, mas mabilis yung movement ng colloids. Okay? Now, what about the electrical properties of colloids? Now, again, class, remember, colloids have charges. The colloidal particles have charges. It can either be positively charged or negatively charged. Now, class, through electrophoresis, okay, it's a mechanism, class, wherein an electric potential is applied to a colloid. The charged colloidal particles then move towards the oppositely charged electrode. So say, for example, class, if my colloidal particle is negatively charged, okay, ano ba? Ito yung well, right? Okay? Ay, kunwari, tama, negatively charged na lang siya. So if this is the well, ilalagay ko dito yung colloid ko. Okay, halimbawa, ito yan. Well, it's 3D, ang itsura niyan 3-dimensionally, class, like this. So ilalagay ko dito yung colloids ko. Colloids ko, obviously, andyan yung dispersion medium, andyan yung dispersion phase. Dispersion phase will be the colloid, which is negatively charged. Negatively charged, ha? Okay, so my colloid is negatively charged. Obviously, class, dahil negative sa side na to, ano mangyayari? Magkakaroon tayo ng repulsion. Tapos positive ang charge dito, so ano mangyayari ngayon? Ang mangyayari, class, yung colloid ko magta-travel papuntang ganyan. So it's going to travel this way. So the direction of the movement, of course, will be towards here. Kasi negative ang charge niya. Okay? So therefore, class, makikita mo clearly ang separation ng colloidal particles sa dispersion phase niya. Oftentimes, kasi ginagamit natin ng electrophoresis to determine proteins. Proteins. Okay? Kasi class, ang proteins will have different charges. Okay? Some are more negative than others. So the more negative it is, class, the higher or mas mataas yung mas pupunta siya dito sa positive charge. Okay? Kaya nakikilala natin, class, ang mga proteins through electrophoresis. Okay? Okay. So I hope that makes sense. All right? So yun siya. Okay? So yun. So through electrophoresis, class, adding electric potentials here. So nagagawa natin, class, ihiwalay separately yung mga different colloids here. Okay? This is actually one-way, class, to isolate colloids as well. Okay? So halimbawa, magkakaroon ka dito ng isang colloid, hanggang dyan lang siya. Iba, meron dito, hanggang dyan. So the more negative the colloid is, the higher it will go here. It will go to the positive charge. Right? So that's, class, so this is a different protein. This will be a different protein, a different protein, a different protein, a different protein. Na-isolate ko lang ngayon yung mga proteins ko. Okay? Or yung different colloids ko. So, ang galing, no? Actually, class, you'll learn more about this sa QC2. Sa akin dito, class, I'll just give you guys the foundation. Okay? Of how the principle works. Next one, electroosmosis. Okay, well, it's the opposite, class, of electrophoresis, wherein, class, ang pinapagalaw ko, instead of the colloids, ang pagagalawin ko, class, would be the dispersion medium. Okay, yung tubig. Now, again, class, normally, in a dispersion medium, the colloids oftentimes is, how do you call this? Kung negative ang colloid ko, class, usually positive ang dispersion medium ko. So, ang gagawin ko dyan, class, say, for example, andito ngayon yung aking, andito yung aking, tawag dito, electrodes. Okay? Ang electrodes ko. Now, class, kung ang colloid ko is negatively charged, ang ilalagay ko sa side niya would be a positive. Di ba kanina sa electrophoresis, negative ang colloid ko, dapat ang katabi niya is negative din. Para mag-repel siya. In electroosmosis, class, it's the opposite. So kung negative ang colloid ko, positive dapat yung katabi niyang anode. Nagets? Para, class, yung colloid ko, dito didikit. Pag ganyan. Tapos ito yung semi-permeable membrane, ano na lang ang magpapass through dyan? Dahil negative ang charge nito, yung dispersion medium na lang ang sasama dito. Ang mapi-filter out dito sa semi-permeable membrane. So does that make sense, class? Nagets ba? Are we clear?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Okay tayo, ha? Okay tayo. So basta tatandaan nyo lang, class, sa electrophoresis, kung ano ang charge ng inyong colloid, yun yung katabi niyang, dito, anode or cathode. Okay? Katabi niyang electrode. Sorry, electrode na lang. Tama. Yun yung katabing electrode niya. Kung negative ang iyong colloid, negative din yung inyong electrode para mag-repel siya. Pero in electroosmosis, class, it will always have to be the opposite charge. So kung negative ang inyong colloid, dapat ang electrode mo is positively charged. Okay? Para mag-attract siya doon. Kasi ang pagagalawin ko lang dito is the dispersion medium. Right? Or the liquid. Okay? Which is oftentimes, class, opposite ang charge niya sa colloid. Okay? Yan. The next one, class, is the streaming potential. So it differs from electroosmosis in that the potential is created by forcing a liquid to flow through a plug or bed of particles. Okay, so you add here, class, instead na gagamit ka dito, class, ng electrodes na may negative dito, may positive dito, ang ginawa dyan, class, gagawa ka ng streaming currents. Streaming currents. Ibig sabihin, opposing, positive, negative, positive, negative, positive, positive, negative. Yan. So, nagka-create ka, class, ng flow. Parang depolarization sa ating nerves. Diba? Nagka-create yung ating, nagka-create yung nerve cells natin ng electric gradient, electric potentials, para gumalaw yung kuryente. Okay, so in this case nga lang, class, you add here an external factor, which is pressure. By adding pressure here, class, napapagalaw mo ngayon yung colloid along this current, streaming current. So therefore, class, habang dumadaan siya ganyan, maghihiwalay na yung mga negative charge, sasama siya lang ngayon dito sa mga, sa charge na to, ng ating electrode. Okay? Yun. And the lastly, class, will be the sedimentation potential. So it's the opposite of electrophoresis. Okay, pero kasi class, ang gagawin mo dito, this time, you allow it to, as the particle settles, there's a creation of potential. Okay, we're in class, normally, ang negatively charged, yung mga colloids natin, okay, obviously, dahil negative ang charge niya, pag nag-sink, okay, pag nag-sink siya, asa na ngayon yung negative charge? Pag nag-sink na class yung mga colloids, obviously, most of the negative charge will be at the bottom. So therefore, yung top portion niya, class, will be positively charged. Okay? So you allow the colloid to settle, okay, pero without using centrifuge, or without using gravity. All right? Okay. Are we good so far?
Yes, sir.
All right. Okay. So now, in terms of stability, class, of the colloids, okay, so sabi nga natin, it's usually accomplished by two means. Okay, either by providing the dispersed particle with an electric charge, okay, para siguradong hindi magsesettle ang inyong colloid. Halimbawa, kung negatively charged ang inyong colloid, pag positively charged ang inyong dispersion medium, class, obviously, the colloid will always be attracted sa dispersion medium. Okay, now this is significant only in lyophobic salts. Or another way, class, to achieve stability, okay, would be to surround each particle with a protective solvent sheet that prevents mutual adherence between when particles collide as a result of Brownian movement. Okay? How do we define, class, a stable colloid? Sinabi ko to kanina, di ba? A stable colloid, class, is a colloid that provides a homogeneous mixture. Homogeneous yung mixture. Dapat homogeneous siya. Ibig sabihin, uniform yung itsura niya. Maliwanag ba tayo? Once you start seeing a separation, class, that is already a sign that the colloid or the system is no longer stable. Pag sinabi ko nagkaroon ng separation, halimbawa, naghiwalay, nagsettle na yung colloids. Once nagsettle na, class, ang colloids, naghiwalay sa kanyang dispersion medium, we say that that colloid, that system is already unstable. Are we clear? Okay. So, how do I prevent? Sabi ko sa inyo, basically, class, a colloid, most often, class, a colloid is a stable system. But of course, it can lead to certain instability. Okay. To prevent it, class, from becoming unstable, one, you can add charge to the dispersion medium. Kung negative ang colloid ko, positive ang dispersion medium ko, the colloid will always stick to the dispersion medium. Make sense? Okay. Make sense? Yan. Now, another way, class, is, tendency kasi minsan, yung colloids natin, despite na negative ang na opposite ang kanilang charges, they can still form aggregates. Okay? So to prevent that from happening, class, I can create a sheet. Okay? Pwede kong balutan yung mga colloidal particles ko ng protective sheet which will prevent it from aggregating. Does that make sense? Okay. Right? Usually, class, ang protective sheet na yun na ilalagay ko dito will be a protective colloid. Okay? Lalagyan ko ng barrier. Kumbaga, kung ito yung colloid ko, lalagyan ko siya ng barrier to prevent it from aggregating or sticking with other colloids, other colloidal particles. So again, class, one thing you have to remember is that a stable colloid will always provide a homogeneous mixture. Okay, so kumbaga, class, kung ito yung colloid natin, oops, wala pala akong pen. Okay. If this is our colloid class, notice that, okay, yung colloidal particles natin class are uniformly dispersed throughout the dispersion medium. Okay, an unstable colloid class oftentimes would lead to aggregation. Nag-aggregate yung particles niya. And then, tendency class is, dahil lumalaki siya, nag-settle down siya. Okay, causing sedimentation. So again, class, that's a hallmark of an unstable colloid. So again, one thing that we can do, class, would be either provide a electric charge sa ating dispersion medium so that the colloids will stay to the dispersion medium, or di kaya, class, put a protective sheet, okay, protective sheet to the colloid particles so that it prevents it from aggregating. Now, some things you have to remember, class. Normally, alcohol and acetone can decrease the solubility of hydrophilic colloids, resulting to coagulation. So hence, class, we try to avoid using alcohol or acetone as part of the dispersion medium. Okay, especially if the colloid is hydrophilic. Okay, kasi nangyayari lang is magko-coagulate lang siya. And then, class, always avoid using colloids that have two charges. Halimbawa, magsasama kang dalawang colloids. Isa is negatively charged, isa positively charged. Remember, class, as much as possible, we want the colloid to have a single charge lang. Kung negative, negative lang. Positive, positive lang. Kasi once na pinagsama mo, class, ang dalawang colloid na negative at saka positive ang charge, ano ang pwede mangyari? It results, class, to coacervation. Okay, coacervation, class, simply is the phenomenon in which macromolecular solutions separate into two layers. Naghihiwalay siya into two layers, class, resulting to the formation of an unstable colloid. So yun yung ayaw natin. Right? Now, another type of colloid, class, that we can often use is what we call a protective colloid. Normally, class, ang protective colloid, ginagamit natin ito to, say, for example, allow the solubility or to protect a drug molecule, okay, and allow it at the same time to dissolve in a dispersion medium. So usually, class, a hydrophilic sol is added to the hydrophobic particles. Okay, to allow, and ang tendency kasi, class, yung hydrophile na to, yung hydrophilic sol will just simply adsorb to the surface of the hydrophobic particle. So say, for example, this is a hydrophobic particle. Okay, HP na lang. So, class, ang gagawin natin dyan, yung hydrophilic sol ko, ang tendency nag-adhere siya sa surface nito. Now, remember, class, this is a hydrophilic sol. So, meaning, class, kahit na lipophilic ito, hydrophobic, yung particle na to, it will still protect, it's going, the hydrophilic sol will protect this particle from being affected by the surrounding dispersion medium. Okay? Now, class, the protective property of a colloid is often expressed in terms of gold number. So, gold number, class, is the minimum weight in milligrams of the protective colloid required to prevent a color change. Yung color change na yan kasi, class, would indicate na wala nang protective property yung colloid. Okay? Wala nang protective property yung colloid na gagamitin mo. So, therefore, class, how much colloid is needed to prevent a color change? So, of course, the lesser amount of protective colloid used, the more potent it is. Right? And examples of protective colloids, class, na madalas natin gamitin in pharmaceutical preparations would include gelatin, albumin, acacia, sodium oleate, and tragacanth. Of course, class, between all of this, popular si gelatin, acacia, at saka si tragacanth. Okay, so sila yung madalas na ginagamit as protective colloids. So, how does a protective colloid work? So, sabi nga natin, class, the colloid that helps to stabilize other colloids is called a protective colloid. Okay, so kung yung inyong colloid, yung particle mo halimbawa is negatively charged or hydrophobic, then you put a hydrophilic colloid. Okay, remember, class, a while ago din. Asa na yun? Diba sabi natin, to increase the stability of a colloid is to put a protective sheet. Okay, so yung protective sheet na yan, pwedeng is a protective colloid. So ang gagawin lang yan, class, yung ating hydrophilic colloid will adhere sa surface ng hydrophobic colloid. Alright? So again, it's one way of protecting the hydrophobic colloid and makes it more stable. So hence, class, it becomes more stable. Ions cannot reach the colloidal particle kasi protected siya eh. Okay? And therefore, class, there is no coagulation happening here. So hindi siya mag-aggregate, hindi siya magse-sediment, hindi siya magse-settle down. Next one, solubilization. So it's the property of association colloids to increase the solubility of materials that are normally insoluble or only slightly soluble in the dispersion medium. Now, what often affects class what are the factors affecting solubilization would be, first would be the chemistry of the surfactants used. Okay, we'll talk more about this class tomorrow kasi mas sikat, mas madalas gamitin ng mga surfactants sa mga coarse dispersions. Okay, the pH, alam naman natin to how pH works, right? You can either make it more ionized or unionized. Pag more ionized, mas water soluble. And then the concentration of these surfactants. So the location, distribution, orientation of the solubilized drugs in the micelle affects the stability of the drug. Okay, relates to the balance between the polar and non-polar properties of molecules. So again, class, another thing that could, another thing that affects solubilization, of course, would be the formation of micelles or the micelles itself. So yung micelles class allows us to, okay, by having a micelle, it allows us to make a drug molecule dissolve in water. Say, for example, if the drug molecule is lipid. So you remember a while ago, class, di ba, ang micelle, a usual micelle would have the hydrophilic heads outside and then hydrophobic tails on the inside. So kung meron akong drug na lipid, so tendency class, ang gagawin ko lang, papasok ko siya sa loob. Alright? And then this lipid drug is already protected or encased dun sa micelle ko, which allows this lipid drug now to dissolve in water. Okay, which is the usual component of our blood. So what are some pharmaceutical applications of colloids? So meron tayong colloidal silver chloride. Usually nilalagay ito sa sa balat lang. It's usually used externally. So if you use germicides, colloidal copper, pero hindi naman itong ginagamit nowadays. Used for cancer. Colloidal mercury, dati ginagamit ito for syphilis, pero nowadays, class, we don't. Okay, kasi as you all know, mercury is poisonous. Then polymers, colloidal polymers such as starch and cellulose, hydroxyethyl starch, and other synthetic polymers. So starch and cellulose normally ginagamit as pharmaceutical adjuncts. Okay? Ito pamparami. Adjuncts lang sila. Ang hydroxyethyl starch ginagamit as plasma substitute. Say for example, may pasyente, dinudugo, walang available na blood, you can use a plasma substitute. I remember one time, sabi raw nila, paano sir kung walang plasma substitute, in need daw, pwede daw ba ang buko juice? Okay, I'm not so sure about that, how sterile that buko juice is to be used as a plasma expander. Okay, pero siguro kung walang-wala na talaga, no? Baka pwede naman, pero I would never recommend that. Okay, then colloidal electrolytes used to increase the solubility, stability, and taste of certain compounds in aqueous or oily preparations. Now, what are some colloid-based delivery system? Okay, pag sinabi natin class colloid-based delivery system, kumbaga yung the mechanism at which I am administering my medication is through the use of a colloid. Okay, examples of those class would be hydrogels, microparticles, microemulsions, liposomes, mamaya pag-usapan natin in details, micelles, and of course, ang pinaka-popular nowadays, nanoparticles. Okay? These are all colloidal-based delivery system, meaning, ginagawa sila class to the use of a colloid. Okay? Kumbaga yung pinaka-drug delivery system ko is a colloid, i-integrate ko na lang yung gamot ko doon sa loob ng colloid na yon. Right? Let's talk about hydrogel class. It's a colloidal gel in which water is the dispersion medium. Now, class, usually ginagamit ang hydrogel as a natural and or it could be natural or synthetic at ginagamit kadalasan class for wound healing, scaffolding and tissue engineering, and as a sustained release delivery system. How do we use hydrogels? Now, remember class, saan gawa ang hydrogels? Mostly, it's made from water. Okay? Na binigyan natin ng solid structure. It's colloidal pa rin nature, ha? Meaning, may mga may particles dyan na suspended in that. That creates the solid matrix. Now, class, since its main dispersion medium is water, pwede ko to class lagyan ng gamot. Say, for example, binuksan ko yung balat dito. May infection, kunwari dyan, may infection. Okay? Or sabihin natin may tumor na lang. Pero wafer ang kadalasan ginagamit dito eh. Pero hydrogels have been gaining property with this. Diba kasi may brain tumor ka? Eh, may tumor dyan. Gagamit ako ng hydrogel na infused with anti-neoplastic agents. Ipapatong ko dun sa tumor. Okay? Now, since it's water-based class, obviously it's non-toxic, right? I-absorb lang yan naturally ng ating katawan. Ang maiiwan na lang would be the anti-neoplastic drug na nakapatong mismo sa tumor, which will allow the tumor to shrink and hopefully die. Okay, so pwede yun. Or di kaya class, halimbawa, sa tissues na lang. Okay, yung tissue engineering, pwede ka malagay ng medications inside. Medication. Okay, may gamot na sa loob niyan. Tapos kasi pag nilagay mo sa loob ng katawan to, at least yung gel na to will create a sustained release delivery system. Ibig sabihin, hindi naman agad-agad i-absorb ng skin mo yung water na to eh. Yung hydrogel na to. Dahan-dahan yan i-absorb. Okay? So therefore, class, dahan-dahan din na-release yung gamot sa loob ng hydrogel na yan. Okay? So some hydrogels provide adsorption, disloughing, and debriding capacities to necrotic and fibrotic tissues. Halimbawa, class, meron kang, alam niyo yung diabetic foot. Okay, yung paa na parang nabubulok na. Okay, so minsan may sugat ka dyan kasi na hindi gumagaling. Usually, pag diabetic ka, you have wounds that do not heal immediately. So, which makes it more prone to infections. So, class, ang isa sa mga applications ng hydrogel is, dun sa sugat mo mismo, yung antibiotics mo will be created in a hydrogel format. Tapos, ipapatong dun sa sugat na yun. Tapos, hahayaan lang siya dyan. Tatakpan, tapos hayaan mo lang i-absorb yan ng katawan mo unti-unti. Now, syempre, class, kung isang bagsakan yung gamot, hindi tatagal. Okay? Tatagal yung... Sorry. Mabilis ma-absorb yung gamot. So, ang tendency, you get high dose, tapos uulitin mo naman yung proseso. Pero kung yan ay naka-hydrogel na, isang salpakan lang sa sugat. Kasi dahan-dahan lang naman i-release yung tawag dito, yung gamot natin. So, therefore, mas tumatagal siya ngayon dun sa sugat. At mas napapagaling natin yung sugat. So they are loaded in pharmaceutical ingredients. Hydrogels provide a sustained drug release. Okay, so yun yung tatandaan natin dito. It's one of the advantages of using hydrogel. So representative systems, pwede tayong gumamit ng alginates, gelatin, chitosan. Okay, chitosan class na form ito using chitin. Very popular to nowadays. Ang chitin kasi class is it's a hydrogel, yes. Okay, pero class, it's one of its medical property class is that it stops bleeding immediately. Halimbawa, may active bleed ka dyan. May gumawa na ngayon class ng aerosol. Okay, aerosol form ng chitosan. In class, in-spray lang sa sugat, biglang titigil yung bleeding. Okay, and chitosan class is derived from chitin, and chitin is derived from the shells of mollusk. Halimbawa, crabs, you can isolate a lot of chitin there. Kaya nga class, karamihan na alala ko dati may year, I forgot what year, 2013 or 2012. Sikat na mga studies sa mga undergrad ang pag-isolate ng chitin. Okay? Kasi nga, ang daming pharmaceutical use ng chitin. Or chitosan. Alright? So yun. So microspheres, synthetic, biodegradable, polymeric hydrogels. Next one are microparticles. Class, ang discussion ko dito sa microparticles almost similar to nanoparticles. Ang pinagkaiba lang, microparticles are obviously larger than nanoparticles. Pero class, their purpose is almost the same. Anong purpose nila? Okay? Ang purpose nila, class, ay i-encapsulate ang drug molecules. Technically, you're creating a protective colloid. Okay? Wherein, class, ini-encapsulate mo yung drug sa loob ng isang colloid. Na halimbawa, kasi parang ito lang yan eh. If this is the colloid, okay, yan yung colloid, ito yung drug. Now, bakit ko gusto i-encapsulate ang drug? One, to protect it. Number two, to allow it to be delivered directly into its target site. Halimbawa, kung target mo class is inside the cell, obviously class, yung colloid ko should be lipophilic. Okay? Kung lipophilic yan class, then it can easily penetrate the lipid bilayer membrane. Tapos pag nakapasok niya sa lipid layer by membrane, mabibiak siya, lalabas kayo yung drug na nasa loob na mismo ng cell. Are we clear? So that's the reason why class normally we load the microsphere. Okay, ito tawag yan microsphere. Kasi nga, kaya nga siya microparticle. Yung colloid natin, niloloadan natin yan ng gamot. Okay, it was initially developed as carriers for vaccines and anti-cancer drugs. Okay? So for microparticles class, it can translocate to tissues into the systemic compartments of the immune system and provoke immunologic response. Okay, and usually a representative system would include polystyrene, polylactide microspheres could be also used. All right. Now, what about for motions and microemulsions? So they usually improve drug solubilization, okay, provides longer shelf life, and ease of preparation and administration. Now, normally class an emulsion and microemulsion, they are usually formed with more or less homogeneous particles, okay, and can provide a controlled and target delivery of different pharmaceutical agents. Okay, they were used to deliver oligonucleotides, okay, small fragments of DNA, specifically to ovarian cancers. Pero again, nowadays class, mas malaki ang use pa rin ng micro or nanoparticles for this. Okay, to deliver anti-cancer drugs directly into cancer cells. Okay? So in contrast to microemulsions, nanoemulsions naman consist of very fine oil in water dispersions having droplet diameters of 100 nanometers. Nanoemulsions class are very fragile system. Okay, they are good sensorial, they are good sensorial properties, so they cause rapid penetration, merging textures, and their biophysical, especially their hydrating power is really good. Okay, in terms of fragile class, kasi mabilis siya mag-break yung nano-emulsions. Konting shear lang class, konting stress lang, pwede mag-break yung system. Kasi nga, they're so minute in size. Okay, kaya mas maganda pa rin gumamit ng nanoparticles or microparticles. Nanoparticles mostly. Now, what about liposomes class? Naalala ko dati kasi I had a friend, ang kanyang master's thesis was to make a liposome, okay, to administer, I forgot what eye medication, tetracycline nata, I forgot. Eye medication is directly sa eye. Kasi one of the problems kasi class sa eye, administering medication sa eye is, pag naglagay ka ng gamot dyan, ano ang unang reaction ng mata mo? Ang unang reaction class ng mata is magluha. So, ang tendency, nawawash away agad yung medication. So, ang ginawa niya class is, gumawa siya ng liposome. A liposome class, okay, consists of an outer layer that is mainly lipid soluble. Class, ang cornea, ang mata natin kasi, can allow the penetration of lipid soluble substances much easier. So now, dahil liposome, tapos inintegrate niya, pinasok niya sa loob yung kanyang antibiotic. Okay, may antibiotic sa loob ng liposome. Ngayon, once na pinatak mo siya sa mata, ang tendency is, since it's lipophilic by nature, whenever na lumuha ka, hindi siya agad-agad na-wash out. At the same time, class, mas malakas ang penetrating capacity ng gamot, ng antibiotic na yun, kasi enclosed siya in a liposome. Alright, so does that make sense? So, ayun. So, just so you know, class, alala ko dati, ang daming lumapit sa kanyang drug companies to get the idea kung paano niya na-form yung kanyang liposome. Okay? So, ayun. Anyway, so they are formed with natural and synthetic phospholipids similar to those in cellular plasma membrane. So, liposomes can be loaded by pharmaceutical ingredients or other ingredients by two principles. First would be, can be associated with liposomal membrane. Or second class, hydrophilic substances can be dissolved in the inner liquid core of liposomes. Pero ang ginawa class ng kaibigan ko was through ultrasonication. Okay, using sound waves. Ultrasonication, yung intense vibration class, para mag-break apart temporarily yung liposome. Once na nag-break apart kasi yan, na ipapapasok niya dito yung kanyang medication. Tapos, palamigin mo ulit yung liposome. Okay? After mapalamig yan class, i-encapsulate na yan. Nasa loob na ngayon yung medication. Okay, so yun yung way niya ng pag-create ng liposome niya. Right? So advantages, they are easy to prepare, biodegradable and non-toxic. Liposomes have found numerous applications as drug delivery system. Okay, representative system would include phospholipids and polymer-based bilayer vesicles. Micelles naman class. Okay, so alam niyo naman ng micelles, right? We've mentioned this a while ago. Outer shell niya usually is hydrophilic. Yung kanyang inner tails would be hydrophobic. They are structured similar to liposomes but do not have a inner liquid compartment. Okay? Unlike that of a liposome kasi, di ba ang liposome ganito yan. Okay, may hydrophilic heads sa labas, may hydrophobic tails, tapos ang hydrophobic tails na yan, sa kabilang end yan, may hydrophilic heads ulit. Okay, kaya most of the time class, water talaga ang liquid yung nasa loob nito. Okay? Liquid, aqueous yung core niya. Pero unlike class of a micelle simply has hydrophilic heads. Okay? Then, hydrophobic tails. Kaya most often than not class, ang kanyang core would be lipid by nature. Not unless class that's a reverse micelle. Right? So it can be used as a water-soluble, biocompatible microcontainer for delivery of poorly soluble hydrophobic pharmaceuticals. So oftentimes, class, if you want to create a drug delivery system for a hydrophilic drug, it's advisable, class, to use a liposome. Kasi sa loob niyan, kasi ang kanyang core is aqueous. Pero kung ang inyong drug product, class, is lipid by nature, okay, hydrophobic, okay, so therefore, class, it's better to create a micelle. Okay, kasi ang micelle, ang core niyan would be more on, it's a lipid core. Right? So make sense? Mga quiz natin, class, yan lang usually tatanungin ko eh. If I have a preparation like this, which one would be a better drug delivery, colloidal drug delivery system? Would it be a micelle? Would it be a liposome? Okay, and so on and so forth. Would it be a nanoparticle? Okay, kasi each one has their own uses naman eh. Advantage and disadvantage. Okay, so for micelles, they have been used extensively in a variety of pharmaceuticals, formulation including delivery of low molecular mass drugs, polypeptides, and DNA. Natural representative for this would be natural synthetic surfactant micelles. Nanoparticles, on the other hand, class. Okay, nanoparticles, like I've said a while ago, okay, kadalasan, class, because of its very minute size, pwede tayo mag-integrate ng kung ano-ano sa loob niyan. Okay, so usually pwedeng DNA, right? Carbon nanotube, metal particles, whatever. Ang dami mong pwedeng ipasok dyan, class. At the same time, it allows the penetration into the cell more efficiently. So it usually ranges from 2 to 100 nanometers. They are submicroscopic colloidal drug carrier systems composed of an oily or an aqueous core surrounded by a thin polymer membrane. Okay, so they are used in topical cosmetics and pharmaceutical formulations. They have also found application as a non-viral gene delivery system, which is what we use nowadays, class, for vaccines. Okay, we integrate the viral gene, pinapasok natin sa loob ng nanoparticles para, class, directly inside the cell ma-release yung yung genes na yun. Okay, at para makilala ng ating immune system. Okay, kaya sabi ko sa inyo, di ba, sa Pfizer BioNTech, they actually are using nanoparticles to deliver the viral genes the genes for the spike proteins of COVID-19. Right, and the representative system, class, would include lipid polymers or inorganic nanoparticles.